The hulking alien fell dead onto the blood-soaked dirt. As Greg Crawford pulled his combat knife free from the Warbeast's skull, the last of hundreds he and his loyal dog Max had slaughtered this day on the scorched battlefield of Zephyria. Greg wiped thick, foul-smelling alien blood from his brow with a torn sleeve as he surveyed the carnage strewn before him. Hundreds of genetically engineered alien killing machines lay still, as smashed crab apples, while a few final death gurgles escaped cracked throats around him. Just moments ago, these abominations had howled in bloodlust, hurling themselves at the lone human with reckless abandon, eager to shred flesh from bone with dagger-like teeth and razor-sharp claws. And one by one they all fell before the human's onslaught. Max let out a triumphant bark, tongue lolling out the side of his mouth as he trotted over to his master, seemingly grinning. The faithful German shepherd was caked head to toe in blue gore, but his eyes shone bright with the thrill of hard-fought victory. Together, this unconquerable pair had faced down the latest waves of monstrous horrors unleashed by the cruel Talarian Empire to crush the Zephyrian rebellion. Genetically perfected alien war beasts, each one easily capable of dismembering an unaugmented man, specifically engineered to slaughter humans without mercy, all to terrorize a planet into submission. But this time they made a fatal mistake. They'd never faced anything like Greg Crawford and his dog Max before. The rebels needed them to hold the line here, needed them to buy time for civilians to be evacuated before the Talarians unleashed the next salvo of nightmares. Because if the beasts broke through, it would mean a massacre of unimaginable proportions, millions of innocent lives snuffed out or enslaved on the Talarians' whims. Greg was all too familiar with the Talarian Empire's ruthless tactics. He'd lost many friends to their warbeasts before, barely escaping as an entire mercenary company was butchered like lambs. Now he was the only thing standing between them and total annihilation of the Zephyrian resistance. A sleek black dropship descended from the ruddy skies, hovering over the battlefield like a steel vulture. Greg gripped his pulse rifle tighter, knowing all too well what came next. The dropship's bay doors yawned open with a hiss, revealing a tall, lithe figure striding out onto the planet's scorched surface, metallic armor glinting in the fading daylight. It was Ilara, one of the Talarians' most vicious and cunning commanders, a master strategist responsible for countless atrocities across the galaxy. "You may have won this battle, human, but you're only delaying the inevitable," Ilara sneered, baring rows of wickedly sharp chromium fangs. His coal-black eyes surveyed the piles of warbeast corpses with detachment and disdain. "The might of the Talarian Empire will crush you and your pathetic allies." Greg hawked a wad of bloody phlegm on the ground, a defiant smirk playing on his grizzled features. Max growled deep and menacing beside him, tensed and ready to strike at his signal. "You haven't met Max and me yet?" Greg called back, voice unwavering. "We'll take on anything you throw at us." Ilara's facial plates twisted into a cruel approximation of a smile. "We shall see, human. I have 1,000 more warbeasts ready to tear you apart at my command. This planet will be mine, and your head will adorn my trophy wall." With that, the alien commander turned on his heel and strode back into the dropship, doors snapping shut behind him as the craft lurched into the air, receding into the horizon. Greg felt a familiar calloused hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Zaya, leader of the Zephyrian resistance, her obsidian skin shining with sweat and spattered blue. Her dark eyes held a mixture of gratitude and grim determination. "Crawford, we owe you our lives yet again," she said solemnly. "But Ilara will return, likely with an entire legion at his back. My people have no one else to turn to. I know it's asking the impossible." Greg gave a curt nod, casting his gaze to the angry red sunset, a strange calm washing over him. One man and his dog making a stand against an empire's might and all their alien horrors. Just the way he liked it. "Impossible's what we do best, Zaya. Max and we'll fight until the very end. We'll show these Talarian bastards what humanity's made of, even if we have to tear them apart one by one with our bare hands." Greg's comm crackled to life as he caught his breath. Max's fur still bristling as the faithful dog kept watch for any remaining threats. The voice on the other end was panicked, urgent. "Crawford, come in. This is Outpost Theta. We're under heavy assault by Talarian forces, warbeasts everywhere. We can't hold them off much longer." "Hold tight, Theta. Max and I are on our way," Greg responded tersely, already sprinting towards their heavily armed hoverbike. He swung a leg over the saddle as Max leaped into the sidecar, engines roaring to life. They tore across the battle-scarred landscape, the acrid stench of burnt metal and alien blood still heavy in the air. Talarian patrols filled the skies, black dropships and attack crafts sweeping the area for any signs of rebel activity. Greg wove between rocky outcroppings and dense patches of foliage, narrowly avoiding detection. Plasma blasts scorched the earth behind them, but he never let up on the throttle. As they neared the outpost, the sounds of combat grew louder, screeches and roars intermingling with the desperate battle cries of the rebels. Greg crested a hill to see the outpost in utter chaos, a tide of warbeasts surging against the rebels' faltering defenses. And there, standing atop a rocky outcropping, was Ilara himself, barking orders to his monstrous soldiers. Greg revved the hoverbike's engines and charged down the hill, Max leaping from the sidecar with teeth bared. They hit the Talarian ranks like a thunderbolt, pulse rifle flashing and jaws snapping. Warbeasts fell left and right, but for each one they felled, two more seemed to take its place. Ilara's cold gaze locked onto the human and his dog, a snarl twisting his metallic features. He hissed commands into his comm unit, and suddenly the warbeasts broke off their attack, melting back into the surrounding wilderness as quickly as they had appeared. The rebels lowered their weapons, exhaustion and confusion etched on their faces. But Greg remained tense, eyes scanning the battlefield. Something wasn't right. His instincts screamed a warning, honed by countless battles against the Talarians' ever-evolving tactics. "Take cover," he shouted, diving behind a shattered wall just as the ground beneath the rebels' feet erupted in a shower of dirt and stone. A dozen camouflaged warbeasts burst from hidden tunnels, all gnashing teeth and slashing claws. The rebels were caught completely off guard, many dragged screaming into the darkness below before they could even raise their weapons. Greg and Max fought with renewed fury, desperate to stem the tide of death, but the warbeasts kept coming, an endless stream of horrors pouring from the tunnels. Ilara's laughter rang out over the carnage, cruel and mocking. "You see, human," he called down from his perch, "I don't need 1,000 beasts to defeat you, I just need to be smarter than you." Greg gritted his teeth, pulse rifle blazing as he tried to shield a group of wounded rebels. Max darted back and forth, jaws red with alien blood. But in his heart, Greg knew Ilara was right. Brute force alone wouldn't win this war. The Talarian commander was always one step ahead, anticipating their every move. As he fought on, rebels falling all around him, a cold realization settled in Greg's gut. If they hoped to prevail, to save Zephyria and countless other worlds from the Talarians' cruelty, he would need to outthink Ilara, match the alien's cunning with his own. But first, they had to survive this battle. Greg reloaded his rifle and charged back into the fray, Max at his side. They would fight to the last, buying time for the rebels to regroup and evacuate the wounded, and then they would find a way to turn the tables on Ilara and his warbeasts. No matter the cost. The battle-weary group took refuge in a damp cave, the cold stone walls providing meager comfort as they licked their wounds. Haunted eyes stared into crackling flames, remembering fallen comrades. Medics moved between huddled forms, applying salves and bandages to bites and gashes. Greg winced as antiseptic stung a deep cut on his forearm, Max whimpering softly at his side. He patted the dog's head, his touch soothing them both. "We'll get that bastard next time, boy. We have to." Suddenly excited murmurs rippled through the cave. A rebel scout pushed his way to Greg, panting. "Crawford, I've got news, big news. Ilara's command ship was spotted at a supply depot not far from here." The wheels turned in Greg's mind, a plan taking shape. This could be their chance to hobble the Talarian war machine and take out Ilara in one fell swoop. I need every scrap of intel you've got on that depot. Security, layout, guard rotations, everything. As the scout rattled off details, Greg turned to Zaya, a fierce light in his eyes. I'm going in. I'll sabotage their Warbeast control systems and rig the place to blow. And if I can get to Ilara... He left the rest unsaid. Max whined, sensing the danger. Greg scratched behind his ears, soothing the dog. I know, buddy, but we have to do this. For the rebels and for everyone else the Talarians have hurt. Night cloaked their approach to the depot. Greg and Max slipping past patrols with stolen access codes. They moved like ghosts, planting explosives at critical junctions. Just a few more charges, and they could slip away, leaving chaos in their wake. Alarms shattered the silence, a piercing wail that set Greg's heart hammering. Shit, we've been made. Go, Max, go! They sprinted through twisting corridors, pulse fire sizzling past as guards shouted. Greg snapped off shots on the run, downing Talarians left and right. Max's jaws flashed, ripping into chrome flesh. Greg kicked open the control room door and froze. Ilara stood waiting, a cruel smile on his metallic face. Hulking shapes emerged from the shadows around him, his elite warbeasts, nightmares of fangs and claws. Did you really think it would be that easy, human? Ilara sneered. I knew you couldn't resist the chance to strike at me directly. Your predictability is your weakness. Greg raised his rifle, his aim unwavering. Max snarled at his side, ready to pounce. Maybe so, but your arrogance is yours. You underestimate us, Ilara. That's a mistake you'll regret. A fierce battle cry tore from Greg's throat as he opened fire, Max surging forward in a blur of fur and fury. Explosions shook the compound, the charges igniting in a chain of thunderous booms. Ilara roared, his beasts leaping to the attack. Pulse blasts lit up the room, flashing teeth and claws meeting in a whirlwind of savagery. Greg and Max fought as one against the onslaught, steel and sinew against the Talarians' twisted creations. Steel clashed on steel, and claws rent flesh as Greg and Max battled Ilara's elite warbeasts in the heart of the Talarian compound. The human and his dog moved as one, pulse fire and flashing teeth taking down the abominations left and right. But for every beast that fell, another leaped forward to take its place. Greg ducked under a swiping claw and drove his knife into a warbeast's neck, hot blood spraying his face. Max darted between the creatures, biting at limbs and hamstringing them for his master to finish off. But the warbeasts kept coming, an unrelenting tide of snarling death. Greg found himself slowly being driven back, his rifle clicks empty. He reached for another magazine, but a beast lunged, knocking him to the ground. Greg grappled with the creature, straining to keep its razor-sharp fangs from his throat. Suddenly a furious bark rang out, and Max slammed into the beast, knocking it off Greg in a flurry of fur and teeth. Dog and beast rolled across the floor in a vicious tangle, Max's jaws clamped tight around the warbeast's neck. Then came a piercing yelp that cut Greg to his core. Max tumbled away from the beast, a smoking hole in his side. Ilara stood over the fallen dog, plasma pistol aimed at Max's head. Rage consumed Greg, a red mist descending over his vision. He charged Ilara with a roar, tackling the Talarian commander to the ground. They grappled for the gun, trading devastating blows. Greg felt bones crack under his fists, but he didn't care. All that mattered was making Ilara pay. His fingers closed around the pistol, and he wrenched it free, pressing the barrel to Ilara's chest. The Talarian's eyes widened in shock as Greg pulled the trigger, a point-blank blast, sending Ilara crashing to the floor in a smoking heap. But there was no time to savor the victory. Explosions rocked the compound, the walls cracking and buckling. Greg scooped up Max, cradling the wounded dog in his arms as he sprinted for the exit. Debris rained down around them. The very air seemed to burn. With a final desperate lunge, Greg burst from the compound just as it erupted in a massive fireball. The shockwave sent him tumbling. Max clutched tight to his chest. Searing heat washed over them as Greg rolled across the ground, shielding Max with his body. When the roar faded and the dust began to settle, Greg uncurled himself, looking down at Max. The dog's flank was scorched and bloodied, but he was still breathing. Hang in there, buddy, Greg whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. We're going to get you patched up. You did good today, real good. Staggering to his feet, Greg cradled Max in his arms and began the long trek back to the rebel hideout. Each step was agony, his body battered and burned. But Greg pushed on, his jaw set with iron determination. They had struck a mighty blow against the Talarians today. Ilara was dead, his compound destroyed. But Greg knew this was only the beginning. The Talarians would retaliate with all their might, and with Max wounded, Greg would have to face them alone. It was a sobering thought, but Greg was no stranger to impossible odds. He had faced them time and again with Max at his side, and though his faithful companion could not fight beside him now, Greg knew Max's spirit would always be with him. Together they had shown the Talarians the indomitable will of humanity, and Greg would continue to fight, to his last breath if need be, to ensure that will triumphed over the aliens' cruelty. Greg burst into the medical bay, Max limp and bleeding in his arms. "Help him!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Rebel medics swarmed around them, gently lifting Max onto a gurney and rushing him into surgery. Hours crawled by as Greg paced the hallway, his boots wearing a groove into the concrete. He couldn't sit still, couldn't breathe. Max was his everything, his reason for fighting, for living. The thought of losing him. The doors hissed open and a doctor emerged, her face drawn and tired. Greg's heart seized in his chest. "How is he?" "We've done all we can," she said softly, placing a hand on Greg's shoulder. "But his injuries are severe. He may not make it through the night." Greg's knees buckled and he sagged against the wall, a strangled sob tearing from his throat. This couldn't be happening. Not Max, not after everything they'd been through. He stumbled into the recovery room, collapsing into a chair beside Max's bed. The dog lay still, his fur matted with blood, tubes and wires snaking from his body. Greg reached out a trembling hand, gently stroking Max's head. "You can't leave me, buddy," he whispered, hot tears spilling down his cheeks. "We still have so much fight left in us." The hours ticked by, Greg never leaving Max's side. He talked to him, reminisced about their adventures, promised him all the treats and belly rubs in the world if he just held on. Suddenly an alarm blared through the base. Greg's comm crackled to life. "All units, we have incoming. Talarian forces are massing for an attack." Greg's blood ran cold. The Talarians were coming, no doubt seeking revenge for Ilara's death. And here he was, helpless at Max's bedside, while his fellow rebels fought and died. He looked down at Max, torn between his duty and his heart. But then a miracle. Max's eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain but still full of that indomitable spirit. His tail thumped weakly against the bed. Greg leaned down, pressing his forehead to Max's. "You rest now, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll finish this, for both of us." He grabbed his pulse rifle and sprinted out of the medical bay, a new fire burning in his veins. He would make the Talarians pay for what they'd done to Max, to all of them. The battle was already raging when Greg reached the front lines. Warbeasts swarmed over the rebel defenses, Talarian soldiers laying down a withering hail of plasma fire. Greg charged into the fray, his rifle spitting death with every squeeze of the trigger. He fought like a man possessed, grief and rage fueling his every move. Warbeasts fell before him, Talarian soldiers crumpling under his relentless assault. But for every enemy he felled, 2 more seemed to take their place. Greg's rifle clicked empty and he cursed, reaching for another magazine. But a warbeast lunged, its claws raking across his chest. Greg cried out in pain, stumbling back. The beast pounced, bearing him to the ground. This was it. This was how he would die, torn apart by Talarian abominations while Max lay dying back at base. Greg closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But it never came. A furious bark split the air and suddenly the beast was gone, knocked aside by a blur of fur and teeth. Max stood over Greg, his flanks heaving, blood seeping from his bandages. "Max!" Greg scrambled to his feet, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "You crazy son of a bitch, what are you doing here?" Max just licked his face, his tail wagging. He was where he belonged, at Greg's side, no matter the odds. Together they turned to face the Talarian horde, pulse rifle and fangs flashing as one. Warbeasts fell left and right, soldiers scattering before the unstoppable duo. The Talarians wavered, then broke, fleeing before the human and his dog. The rebels cheered as Greg and Max limped back into the base, battered and bloodied but unbroken. They had won the day, but the war was far from over. Greg knelt beside Max, running his fingers through the dog's fur. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured. Max nuzzled his hand, his eyes shining with love and loyalty. No matter the threats they faced, no matter the odds, they would always have each other. And together they would keep fighting, until the Talarian threat was nothing but a memory, for the rebels, for the innocent, for the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.